We will start as soon as Mr. Keating arrives. Thank you. The Subcommittee on Europe of the House Foreign Affairs Committee will continue and come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to examine the President's State Department and Foreign Operations budget request for Europe and Eurasia for fiscal year 2024. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Our investments in Europe and Eurasia pay massive dividends for American prosperity and our national interest. Collectively, the European Union is one of America's closest trade partners. In 2019 alone, our trade with the EU totaled an estimated $1.1 trillion. Europe is also home to almost all of our NATO military allies, who we are treaty-bound to defend and who are also treaty-bound to defend us. Diplomatically and politically, the United States counts European countries among some of our closest friends, and others in Europe and Eurasia are clamoring for closer ties with America. National security and the economic prosperity of the United States is inextricably linked to the security and prosperity of Europe and Eurasia. But our relationship with the region goes deeper than that. The ties that bind us together are our shared values: freedom, democracy, the rule of law, the right to self-determination. Over the decades together, we have joined forces in support of those values to defeat fascism, stare down the threat of communism, and to promote democratic ideals around the world. It is all the more important now that we continue to hold true to our shared values as Russia and China seek to expand their influence in Europe and Eurasia to the detriment of American national security interests. Of course, American taxpayers cannot carry the weight of that burden alone. I hope that our witnesses today can speak to how our European allies are also stepping up with the investments in their own security to combat Russian aggression and malign Chinese influence. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine was a watershed moment in changing our shared views of the threat from authoritarian actors around the world. We also must ensure that we jointly act on that threat as well. Towards that end, it's very encouraging that Europe is now providing Ukraine with more economic and humanitarian assistance than the United States. Congress has the power of the purse and the duty to provide oversight of the executive branch. With that in mind, it is incumbent on all of us to take a close look at the President's fiscal year 2024 budget request for Europe and Eurasia. As we know, this request is not the official budget of the United States. We here in Congress will write that later, but it's a reflection of the priorities of this President and this administration. Unfortunately, the President's budget request for Ukraine in particular leaves us with many questions. The level of funding requested by the administration is comparable to the pre-war levels and is, to be blunt, inadequate to meet the needs of Ukraine. This suggests that the administration will instead continue to rely on supplemental appropriations to provide funding for Ukraine. However, no one from the administration has approached Congress about a future supplemental. In fact, recent news reports suggest that the administration will not request any supplemental funding from Congress before the end of the fiscal year. I urge the administration to engage with Congress robustly and as soon as possible on a strategy for after the coming counteroffensive, its assessment of Ukraine's needs, and its diplomatic engagement with our allies to ensure that everyone is paying their fair share. I hope our witnesses today will be able to preview some of these discussions. Let me be clear. Saying the administration is prepared to support Ukraine for as long as it takes without laying the groundwork with Congress on how to fund this commitment is unfortunately not a strategy, but an empty and thus irresponsible promise. I want to once again thank our witnesses for being with us today, and now I'll turn to Ranking Member Keating for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for having this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses for joining us on this important hearing to conduct oversight on the State Department and USAID's budget priorities for the fiscal year 24. The State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development play critical roles in global peace and stability. As General Mattis said, if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition, ultimately. I agree with General Mattis and strongly believe that the State Department and USAID play important roles in preventing conflicts, encouraging stability, and developing coalitions based on shared values to counter the common threats and global changes we face today. These words are more important than ever as the Biden administration leverages our global alliances and partnerships to counter Chinese malign influence and to support Ukraine in their fight for democracy, freedom, and ultimately for their future. Before I speak briefly on the topics that I believe are and should remain top priorities for the State Department and USAID in 24, I want to thank our witnesses for their tireless efforts to support the people of Ukraine and their fight for freedom. I know the State Department and USAID have overcome significant security and logistical hurdles to meet emerging needs in Ukraine and in the region, while also ensuring American dollars are being spent for their intended purposes through comprehensive monitoring and oversight mechanisms. Beyond the work America is doing to support Ukraine in a hot war, I believe the U.S. economy and humanitarian assistance is essential to ensure Ukraine can maintain essential government institutions and public services for its citizens. Ukraine must secure a stable and prosperous future for all its citizens, and the U.S. non-military assistance will ensure Ukrainians have a country to return to, a country to come home to, a country to rebuild after this war is over. Providing anything less will make many of our efforts be in vain. I also want to acknowledge the efforts of the State Department and USAID that they've made to ensure justice and accountability for war crimes being committed against those living in Ukraine. As many of you know, I've prioritized these issues with my work here in Congress, and I'm thrilled that just last week, House Res 81, a resolution, bipartisan resolution I introduced in support of establishing a special tribunal on the crime of aggression, passed favorably out of this committee. I hope we can move forward with a vote on the floor on that soon. Next, I want to highlight the importance of the work the State Department and USAID in promoting democracy, promoting human rights, promoting good governance in Europe and in Asia. I'm pleased that the USAID announced in December new initiatives to support democratic resiliency in Central Europe. I believe these efforts, particularly in Hungary, are essential to respond to democratic backsliding that has emerged across the region. Further, as I mentioned last week, I continue to be concerned with the developments in Georgia, particularly their attempt to pass a Russian-style foreign agent registration law. Finally, as we wait to see the results of Turkey's presidential election runoff, I'm worried that the continued role by the Justice and Development Party will result in additional efforts by President Erdogan to centralize power and subvert the rule of law in Turkey. As I believe, it's more important than ever right now to develop an interagency strategy to coordinate our efforts in the Black Sea region, and I look forward to reviewing the State Department strategy as well in that area in the coming months. Finally, I'd like to highlight a few remaining issues that I'm particularly interested. First, I want to express my continued support for the Trade and Technology Council as a platform to further develop democratic and market-oriented values. Next, I continue to encourage the State Department and USAID efforts to maintain peace and stability in Northern Ireland. And I want to thank your agencies for your work in relation to the Windsor Framework. Lastly, I'm pleased that through the work of the Belarus Caucus, we're able to increase funding to support civil society in Belarus. And I hope to hear details soon about the appointment of a special envoy and the establishment of a strategic dialogue to liaise with democratic movements in Belarus. Finally, with my remaining time, I'd like to acknowledge that for the two relatively small bureaus within the State Department and USAID, we've asked you to take on an extremely long list of strategically important tasks. At the same time, I want to point out that my Republican colleagues have voted to cut across the board the State Department and USAID's budget by 22%. I hope we can address these budget proposal issues during this hearing, and I believe such cuts will have a devastating impact on our foreign and diplomatic efforts and produce results that run counter to our national security priorities. With that, again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Keating. I would like to welcome the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider, who is joining us today. He will participate following all other members of today's hearing. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this important topic. Ambassador Dereck Hogan is the Acting Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the Department of State. He is joined by Ms. Maria Longi, the Coordinator of U.S. Assistance to Europe and Eurasia at the State Department. And finally, we have before us Ambassador Erin McKee, who is the Assistant Administrator of the Bureau for Europe and Eurasia at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Thank you all for being here today. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I'll ask each of you to keep your verbal remarks to 5 minutes in order to allow time for member questions. I now recognize Ambassador Hogan for his opening statement. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Chairman Kean. Ranking Member Keating and members of the subcommittee, thank you today for the opportunity to testify on the President's fiscal year 2024 budget request for Europe and Eurasia. This subcommittee knows the stakes. The U.S. support is a lifeline for Ukraine under Russian assault and other frontline states vulnerable to Russian aggression and malign influence from authoritarian actors like the PRC. With the support of Congress, the United States is rising to meet the test of this moment. The President's fiscal year 2024 request seeks to advance this vital effort with $1.49 billion for foreign assistance for Europe and Eurasia, $581.2 million for diplomatic engagement, and $99.9 million for public diplomacy. This comes in addition to the $58.7 billion in extraordinary security, economic, and humanitarian support we have marshaled for Ukraine thanks to bipartisan congressional support since February 2022. Today I want to talk about how our assistance supports 5 key areas that advance a whole, free, democratic Europe, even as Russia wages full-scale war on one of its neighbors. First and foremost, our assistance is supporting Ukraine to continue its successful defense and win the future. Our fiscal year 2024 request, with clear oversight and accountability, will support democratic, justice sector, and rule of law reform, and accelerate Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations. Ultimately, these efforts aim to give Ukraine the tools to help defend its territory, consolidate its democracy, and move further into the EU and global markets. Second, our assistance requests will fortify a Europe more resilient, more independent, and more anchored to Euro-Atlantic institutions. Across the region, our support will advance the modernization and sustainability of allies and partners' military capabilities, buttress the region against economic coercion from the PRC, and reduce dependence on Russian energy. Third, our request seeks to advance the Euro-Atlantic aspirations of our frontline partners. In Moldova, we are supporting a vulnerable country with a clear Euro-Atlantic trajectory to weather a strained budget while simultaneously addressing corruption, security concerns, an energy crisis, and cyber vulnerabilities. In Georgia, we are helping to improve democratic governance, elections, and political processes, and the rule of law. In Armenia and Azerbaijan, U.S. diplomacy and assistance are actively supporting direct engagement between the two governments, as well as between the people of Azerbaijan and Armenia, to achieve a sustainable and durable peace. In the Western Balkans, our assistance helps address serious challenges, for example, helping normalize relations between Kosovo and Serbia, strengthening the rule of law and independent media, fighting corruption, enhancing cybersecurity, and promoting energy diversity. Even today, to support the democratic aspirations of the Belarusian and Russian people, we continue our programs to sustain civil society advocacy and access to objective media despite increasing government repression. Fourth, our assistance is catalyzing our allies and partners in the G7, in the EU, in NATO, in the United Nations, and elsewhere to address these shared challenges together with us. And I look forward to discussing many of these priorities together that we are working on with our European partners and allies in our question and answer session. Finally, our diplomatic program budget makes it possible to fund platforms and personnel across 80 posts and here at home in the service of U.S. leadership and U.S. foreign policy objectives in all of these efforts. With your bipartisan support, our fiscal year 2024 budget will enable the U.S. to rise to meet the test of this moment, just as millions of Ukrainians have done. Thank you for inviting me to testify today and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador Hogan. I now recognize Ambassador McKee for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Kean. Ranking Member Keating, distinguished members of the Subcommittee on Europe, I really appreciate the opportunity to testify about the President's fiscal year 2024 budget request and its importance for USAID's foreign assistance programming across Europe and Eurasia. As you all know, we are over a year into the Kremlin's unprovoked war against Ukraine, a war that has displaced approximately 13 million people, including more than 8 million who have been forced to flee the country. However, thanks to bipartisan support from Congress over the past year, we have been able to provide life-saving and critical services to the citizens and to the government of Ukraine. From assisting heroic workers to keep the heat and lights on while Putin attempted and failed to weaponize winter, to providing mobile heat distribution systems, generators for heating hospitals, businesses, mobile boiler houses, temporary heating shelters for thousands of people who lost their homes, and access to heat and light. Your support lets us continue to assist these people of Ukraine. The President's request reflects an increase in assistance for Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia, or IECA, and global health programming from $301 million in 2021 to $522 million in 2024 for USAID. Funds will be used to address critical mid- and longer-term priorities such as bolstering anti-corruption, strengthening an independent media to actively combat disinformation that seeks to undermine Ukraine and the West, catalyzing private investment and job creation. Russia's war against Ukraine has compounded regional challenges elsewhere. Pro-democracy activists have been forced into exile in Belarus. In response, USAID has supported an independent Belarusian media outlet that continues to operate in exile with a reach of between 2 to 5 million unique visitors a month, half of whom are within Belarus. Moldova continues to feel the economic and energy consequences of Russia's strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure as the energy supply continues to be a geopolitical weapon. Congress has enabled USAID to provide $412 million in supplemental assistance to Moldova, including $300 million additional targeted support to the energy sector, which is vital for stabilizing the sector and increasing energy interconnectivity with European markets. Looking ahead to 2024, the request of $55 million for Moldova will advance democratic and anti-corruption initiatives, expand partnerships, including with the private sector. The Kremlin's malign influence also exploits local fissures in the Western Balkans, aiming to disrupt peace and stability. The President's request of $108 million provides crucial funding to counter this malign influence and bolster the regional economy. In Kosovo and Serbia, USAID remains focused on supporting the entire U.S. government efforts to further the EU-led normalization dialogue. Bosnia and Herzegovina continues to be manipulated by Russia's control of the energy supply. The request of $31 million for USAID and state will assist stakeholders to reform, restructure, and diversify the country's natural gas market. Energy reform and security will strengthen democratic freedom by demonstrating that democracy can deliver, which is more important than ever as the leader of the country's Republic Srpska entity, Milorad Dodik, increases his dangerous political rhetoric. In North Macedonia and Albania, resources will support enduring efforts toward Euro-Atlantic integration by partnering with citizens, civil society, media, and the private sector to fight against corruption and demand government transparency. And in the South Caucasus, USAID's work in Georgia remains critical to safeguard the country's democracy and prospects for Euro-Atlantic integration. And in Armenia and Azerbaijan, the situation in the region of Nagorno-Karabakh continues to be of great concern, as the blockage of the Lachin corridor has resulted in civilians of Nagorno-Karabakh to lose or have reduced access to essential services, medical treatment, and basic commodities. Thanks to Congress's focus and attention on Central Europe, we have stronger relationships with civil society in Hungary and Poland. FY 2024 resources will allow us to build the skills of local organizations, independent media, and civic actors to promote democracy and protect those fundamental freedoms. The challenges we face in Europe and Eurasia are expansive and complex, but the resources provided by Congress to date, and as requested in the President's budget request for FY 2024, allow for USAID to make a critical impact to strengthen the foundations of freedom in Europe and Eurasia on behalf of the American people. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Chairman Kean and Ranking Member Keating, for inviting me to testify before you today. My colleagues, Ambassadors Hogan and McKee, have spoken about the President's FY24 budget request for Europe and Eurasia. I would like to address the on-the-ground impact our assistance has had and how it advances U.S. national interests, particularly in the midst of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I'll start with the energy security issue. In Ukraine, as Ambassador McKee mentioned, our assistance has helped Ukraine maintain citizens' access to power and heat in the face of Russia's escalated attacks on the electricity grid last winter. In partnership with other donors, we have already begun planning for this coming winter with a more decentralized, efficient, and cleaner energy system compatible with the EU grid, while also providing support for EU integration on electricity trade, gas sector support, and nuclear safety and security. Elsewhere, when Moldova faced its own energy crisis this winter, we channeled assistance to enable reverse flow gas transfers from the Trans-Balkan pipeline, facilitate open market gas purchases, and link Moldova to the European electricity grid. And in a number of countries, including Armenia, we are assessing the feasibility of small modular nuclear reactors built with U.S. technology that could facilitate greater energy independence from both Russia and the PRC. We've also directed our assistance to strengthen good governance across the region with programs that improve transparency and fight corruption. These programs help enable economic transformation and Euro-Atlantic integration. In Ukraine, our assistance has strengthened transparent and independent anti-corruption, tax, and budget auditing authorities, and has improved corporate governance and state management, building the framework necessary to ensure a swift and ethical reconstruction at war's end. We've also bolstered the digitization of procurement, including in Ukraine's corruption-prone construction sector, and e-governance. These programs have made clear impact on investor confidence. Ambassador McKee and I were in Kyiv last month when the Horizon Capital Growth Fund announced a $250 million investment round for the community's private sector. The U.S. government helped create the managers of this fund, and the DFC contributed $25 million to the fund. And there were quite a number of private businesses there anxious to start investing more in Ukraine. In Moldova, our assistance has empowered marginalized communities, strengthened civil society oversight over public procurement, and expanded independent local news sources across the country. In Kosovo, our recent support has helped transform the country's commercial court, reducing backlogs and significantly improving participant satisfaction. In Albania, we have strengthened the anti-corruption structure as it went after powerful corrupt forces, including crooked cops, members of parliament, and even a former deputy prime minister. In Montenegro, we supported investigative journalists whose work led to the arrest of the country's Supreme Court president. And in Serbia, viewership of U.S.-supported independent media has grown by over 30%. Our law enforcement and security assistance is also producing results in the region and beyond. We are facilitating partnerships between the Illinois State Police and counterparts in Georgia to bolster respect for human rights in the law enforcement community. And in the United States has provided body-worn cameras to 50 police stations across North Macedonia, reducing corruption complaints by 34%. An embedded U.S. prosecutor in Albania is advising on the vetting of judges and prosecutors, which so far has resulted in 60% of the judges and prosecutors screened leaving their positions. Finally, let me end on the human dimension of Russia's war. U.S. assistance has been supporting the brave men, women, and children of Ukraine as they cope with Russia's onslaught. It has provided hospitals and it has powered hospitals and facilities caring for thousands of wounded veterans and civilians and funded consultations for more than 40,000 internally displaced people. We've supported independent verification of Russia's atrocities by the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission and others across multiple domains, including satellite imagery, social media, and traditional reporting. Ultimately, the immense tragedy of Russia's war of choice underscores the urgency of our assistance right now. This is just a brief snapshot of the power of American assistance. With bipartisan congressional support, our FY24 budget request for foreign assistance, a 7% increase over the FY23 request, will do more to advance an energy-independent, democratically strong, economically resilient region on the path toward a Europe whole, free, and at peace. As my colleagues have noted, our assistance underlies U.S. leadership in Europe and Eurasia, and it has helped us catalyze the efforts of our allies and partners so that we can address challenges in the region together. We're committed to using the resources Congress provides to continue this work, to advance our goals and strengthen our partnership, and to serve the American people. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Longi, and we now recognize myself for 5 minutes, and we will be very strict on the 5-minute rule. And Chairman Keating will be back in a few minutes. In the meantime, something the Chairman said really struck home to me and how important Europe is. In the district I represent, I've got the largest Michelin plant in the world. I'm very grateful in upstate South Carolina we have the largest BMW facility in the world. And so it's really clear Europe means jobs. As we're discussing issues, it's really refreshing that substantially what you're doing is bipartisan. A classic case was yesterday, led by Congresswoman Ann Wagner. In Luxembourg, we had a vote of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. It was unanimous to support territorial integrity for Ukraine. It was unanimous to oppose the ideology and practices of Russism, which the New York Times has defined as Russian fascism. And so with that in mind, I am concerned, though, that the budget request for Ambassador Hogan, there's been a reservation about providing long-range missiles, ATACMS, to Ukraine. The United Kingdom is providing Storm Shadow cruise missiles with a similar range. Is the administration reconsidering the faulty assumption about long-range missiles being inherently escalatory, given the fact that the government of Ukraine has abided by the UK's request not to use the system against targets in Russian territory? And does the U.S. feel you can accept President Zelensky's promises not to target Russian territory?
Thank you, Congressman Wilson, for that question. I would say that the administration is constantly assessing the needs of the Ukrainian armed forces. We have been doing that throughout, and our security assistance reflects the opportunities that we see for Ukraine to preserve its territorial integrity. And so when it comes to specific weapon systems like the ATACMS, that is always under consideration. But at this time, what we have provided to the Ukrainians is what we think the Ukrainians need at this time. Thank you.
And I'm glad that's being considered. Indeed, it's bipartisan. Over the weekend, It was tremendous that Intelligence Chairman Mike Turner had the opportunity at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly to announce the decision by the administration of F-16s to protect the delivery of grain, air cover for Ukraine to protect its citizens. One of the main objectives, again, Ambassador Hogan, of the budget request is to improve European energy security as the continent diversifies away from Russian energy. In fact, the administration was very successful in reaching an agreement between Israel and Lebanon to offshore drilling in the Mediterranean, and then a side consequence, the oil is refined in Egypt and then sent to Italy. And so we need, you've been creative. We want you to be even more creative because I'm concerned about China's dominance of the renewable energy technology and its growing nuclear power and industry. And we must ensure that we don't move from dependence on one authoritarian state to another. And so, Ambassador, what presence does China already have in the European energy market? In particular, has its nuclear power industry made any headway in the European market?
Sir, I would say that when it comes to energy security, this has been one of the opportunities, the strategic opportunities that we've seen come as a result of Russia's heinous invasion of Ukraine. Europe, in a sense, saw that dependence on Russian hydrocarbons is a bad bet. And so we have been working hand in hand with our European partners and allies to diversify away from that. And when it comes to U.S. LNG, for example, 2/3 of our LNG exports went to Europe, and so we're on track to do something like that for this year as well. When it comes to renewables, we also see a real strategic opportunity here. Both Europe as well as the United States view the importance of reliable, trustworthy supply chains. And so, for example, the U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council focuses almost exclusively on these sorts of issues. How do we increase the resilience of our respective supply chains?
And thank you very much, but I am very concerned about dependency on Chinese batteries, and we need to be not dependent. With that in mind, I'm really grateful to recognize the ranking member, Bill Keating, for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mentioned in my opening remarks Leader McCarthy's proposed 22% budget cut to reduce State Department and USAID funding to levels in your agency. These are levels that we haven't seen since 2010, well over a decade ago, at a time when historically so much is at stake right now in terms of democracy, security here at home as a result, and the role of China. You know, Russia has a hot war going on. We discussed that in so many other committees, including Armed Services, which we both share. But you know, at the same time, even preceding this war, China has been moving in its own campaign in Eurasia and Eastern Europe, and using enormous economic influence and trying to move away from democracies and undercut them to authoritarian regimes. With this in mind, with so much at stake, I mean, how devastating would these cuts be to our ability to counter China and their activities?
I can start off with that. I'm sure my colleagues would be able to chime in as well. Congressman, Mr. Ranking Member, it would be devastating, that impact to our ability.
I'm sorry, could you move the microphone a little closer? I'm
sorry.
Probably my hearing.
No, it's, excuse me, sir. It would be devastating, that sort of cut to our budget. Right now, we are in a situation where Russia, as well as the PRC, are trying to upend the rules-based international order. And the PRC, China, is using economic coercion. It's using massive disinformation as part of its toolkit. We have been diplomatically as well as programmatically countering that. And so this budget represents our efforts to advance those goals.
And I can add a little more. The FY24 budget request, we feel, is a number that would help let us sustain the programmatic investments that we've made in the past. A 22% decrease would require us to make some very, very difficult choices on the programming, including the investments we've made in Ukraine and in the region.
Well, with the region in particular, I would say this. If we're having cuts of the magnitude that I mentioned, aren't we essentially putting the white flag up, in our ability to counter China? And we can't ignore that threat. China's going to be important in the war itself because we're not successful. Certainly, it shows that aggression can work in this world, and certainly they've indicated with Taiwan what their intentions are. But aren't we ceding this area right now to China by not meeting our budgetary needs, which I hate to talk numbers, but this is like investing in the front line of democracy in our fight with China, that they're bringing on, not on the hot war, but on the economic and diplomatic front, the coercive activities they've taken, the anti-democratic activities they've been involved in. These have real impact. Wouldn't a cut of that size have an enormous impact on our ability to even compete with China in that front?
I would say that much of our programming directly is intended to help these countries with energy independence, with their economic stability, with getting good information and facts out there. And yes, our ability to counter Russia and the malign influence of PRC would be affected by this type of a cut.
Yeah, and I'm concerned. One day this war will be over, and I'm convinced Ukraine will be successful. But what happens then and what happens right after that is so important. If we're not acting on these issues now, and if you could in 1 minute, where will we be at the end of this war?
We would be in a very difficult situation. That's why we are pursuing these things simultaneously. That's why our budget request reflects what we are trying to do to counter Russian aggression as well as PRC malign influence. Just one particular example, investment screening, for example. This is something that is critical to countries' abilities to be able to evaluate the potentially spurious investments from the PRC. And so our assistance has been able to help these countries, these governments in Europe, be able to identify those bad deals for them so that they don't end up with a situation where critical infrastructure, for example, now belongs to the PRC.
Yeah, those predatory loans,
Exactly.
their influence. If we're not there and we're not competing, they've got that arena all to themselves. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Keating, and we now recognize full committee Vice Chairwoman Ann Wagner.
I thank the chairman, and I'm grateful to our witnesses for their time and service. Indeed, as mentioned, Congressman Wilson and I just returned yesterday from the spring meeting of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and I was so proud and gratified to find that NATO's commitment to Ukrainian victory in the brutal Russian war is unshaken, and we will continue as a U.S. delegation to push all NATO members towards their commitment of 2% of GDP towards defense and beyond that towards NATO. Ukrainians are making unimaginable sacrifices to demonstrate to tyrants around the world that aggression against innocent and peaceful nations will never be tolerated. The U.S. must give Ukraine the tools to succeed, and now is not the time to waver. Russia and China hope to see the U.S.-led coalition against Putin fracture, and we need to use every opportunity to signal to our adversaries that we remain united against aggressors. Deputy Assistant Secretary Hogan, just a quick side question here. Has the administration why has the administration not yet appointed a new U.S. Special Envoy to Belarus, and the post that's been vacant since June 2022? Just real briefly.
Very briefly, we are in the process of doing that, Congresswoman. We are waiting right now for the transition in the European Bureau, the bureau that I'm representing. That will be happening this summer. The person that we expect to put in that position will be coming in, and then we'll move forward with that process.
Talking about Russian aggression, it is very important that we get that special envoy there as quickly as possible.
Fully agree.
I hope that you'll keep the committee and Congress informed of that decision when it's taken. Thank you. Despite Russia's ongoing full-scale war in Ukraine, the Kremlin has not ceased its efforts to spread its as I said, malign influence across Europe. Again, Assistant Secretary Hogan, how has Russian influence in Europe and Eurasia evolved since the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine? And have its tactics and priorities changed? And how are U.S. activities adapting to reflect the situation on the ground, sir?
Thank you, Congresswoman. The Russian narrative is basically that Ukraine is at fault, that the United States is at fault, that NATO is at fault for the war, and then they go beyond that, and they of course work hand in hand with the PRC. The Russian and Chinese malign influence are very much complementary. They also try to make the point that this war is having a disastrous effect on food security, and that we are part and parcel of that. So that is what they're trying to spin, and I think the UN General Assembly resolutions make clear that it is Russia that is at fault, that Russia is the aggressor, that Ukraine is a victim. So we are using multilateral institutions. Last week we had the Council of Europe Summit. That was the first multilateral institution that kicked Russia out for its aggression in Ukraine, and we are doing the same thing when it comes to PRC malign influence as well.
I'll say, sir, we need to really adapt and push back harder. I am also gravely concerned about Russia's destabilizing activities in the Western Balkans, and particularly Bosnia, where it is empowering dangerous and corrupt politicians like Milorad Dodik. The U.S. must continue to prioritize engagement with Western Balkan countries, whether promoting the region's integration into NATO and the EU or punishing the bad actors who are trying to hold the region back. Again, Assistant Secretary Hogan, how does your budget support enhanced engagement in the Balkans to insulate the region from adversary influence and get it back on track for membership in European and transatlantic institutions?
Thank you again, Congresswoman. The budget is very much focused on moving these countries towards the Western Balkans countries, including BIH, towards its Euro-Atlantic end state. These countries have all, except for Serbia, have all made NATO as well as EU their endpoints, both of these institutions. And so our assistance is moving these countries in that direction when it comes to corruption, being able to fight corruption, when it comes to standing up and strengthening democratic institutions such as watchdog agencies, independent media. So we've got a lot of tools in place to be able to move these.
Thank you. I'd really like some more specifics on this, because I didn't follow that whole thought process there at all. I want specifics, sir, if you could, in writing, about how the budget supports enhanced engagements in the Balkans, specific to Bosnia. I thank the chair for their indulgence, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Chairwoman Ann Wagner, and we're very grateful to have Congresswoman Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Keating. Thank you to our witnesses for your work and, of course, for your testimony today. As we entered the second year of the conflict in Ukraine, with looming counteroffensives on the horizon, how have Ukraine's non-security assistance needs changed over the course of the last 14 months? Is the pace of congressional support and appropriations keeping pace with those needs? And where in Ukraine are humanitarian needs the very highest?
Thank you for that. The needs some of the needs have indeed changed. You saw one primary example is on the energy front. When Russia attacked the energy grid so aggressively last October, we quickly pivoted and used some of the supplemental funding that Congress provided to help with emergency repair equipment. And auto transformers and generators, and so we were able to use those resources to address those changed conditions. I think over the course of the year, the need for budget support has also been a lot more evident and has become more clear as the government has adjusted to the war, as the government of Ukraine has adjusted and watched its resources decline and watch the needs for their basic keeping their government functions going, stabilize. I think we were able to come in with assistance for budget support. So those were two areas.
Ambassador
McKee
McKee,
probably
from
has.
USAID's perspective?
Yes, I would say that the areas that we had to pivot the most rapidly and also expand were in the areas of the agricultural sector, which is critical not only for putting food on Ukrainians' citizens' table, but to help feed the world. And so we worked closely across the interagency to develop, and our European partners to develop the solidarity lanes and provide an alternative to the Black Sea blockade. That effort is ongoing and the needs continue. The planting season and cycle needs to be sustained. The other area that we both expanded and shifted in terms of our technical assistance was in the energy sector. As Putin weaponized winter, we responded to help try and keep the water running, the heat on, and the lights on. But with an eye towards what Ukraine is trying to achieve in the future, we know that the energy architecture is sort of ground zero for kleptocracy, is to build a decentralized, deregulated, modern, and sustainable energy architecture for the future that can absolutely integrate and support the EU and the surrounding areas. And so those would be two areas I would point out that we shifted, both the nature of our programming and obviously the size and focus.
As we're in the spring and summer months, Ambassador McKee, and thinking of the fall and harvest again, is there reason to be optimistic that the support that Ukraine is getting for the agricultural sector is going to be effective for them to produce?
Absolutely. Until the Black Sea opens up, obviously, their ability to export in the volumes that they did pre-conflict remains a challenge. But we've gotten smart with our partners and allies in terms of better inputs, using ag tech, rendering the planting field safe for both planting and harvest, since the Russians tend to mine everything in their wake. They're weaponizing not only winter, but also food. And so hand in glove, trying to sustain the sector, and those investments have essentially provided the relief that the farmers need, not to the order of pre-war magnitude. But I do know that, for example, when we were in Bucharest just a couple of weeks ago, the Romanians are counting through the solidarity lanes, an uptick in throughput in the investments that we made in the reducing the bottlenecks of the overland and littoral routes. And so we remain hopeful that it's a lifeline. It's certainly not the order of magnitude that will be necessary until the Black Sea opens up.
Okay. And Ambassador Hogan, shifting lanes to Azerbaijan and Armenia, I met with the Deputy Foreign Minister of Azerbaijan today, and we know that the Secretary of State early this month said that there was progress toward peace, some notable, I'm paraphrasing, notable movement in the negotiations. Can you give me an update on the negotiations for long-term peace? And I'm thinking of, in particular, the blockade, the controversy and the blockade, and when we hope that will be fully opened.
Thank you, Congresswoman Dean. The process is moving forward. The peace process, the Secretary hosted the two foreign ministers in early May to work through some of the most contentious issues, including, for example, the distancing of forces along the border, dispute resolution mechanism in the treaty that we are trying to facilitate agreement on, the rights and securities of the ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. These are a lot of the issues that we were working through. We put forward a number of proposals that gave the two sides perhaps some bridging language there, so they've been taking that back and studying it. Since then, we've been working very closely with the European Union. They hosted, Charles Michel hosted the leaders actually in Brussels just a couple of weeks after we hosted the foreign ministers, and then they will be meeting again, the two leaders, Azerbaijani and Armenian leaders, with the presidents of Germany, the Chancellor of Germany, the President of France, as well as EU President Charles Michel, to again focus on what needs to be done to actually get this across the finish line. We still have a long ways to go, and when it comes to the Lachin corridor, that's something that the Secretary, that's something we've been pushing very hard on, particularly when it comes to the opening up of commercial as well as private vehicles.
And I realize I've gone way over. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for your focus on that.
Thank you, Ms. Dean. We now proceed to Congressman Self of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to read one sentence from what you provided to us. It's on page 16. I don't know the document. It's probably your request. Failure to preserve a free and fair economic environment would not only limit economic growth and exclude economically disadvantaged groups, but would also create more permissive environments for corruption and transnational crime, threatening U.S. national security as well as that of its allies and partners. You have described the United States in our debt ceiling negotiations. I know you don't work for the Treasury Department, but I couldn't have stated it better. I agree with the ranking member who just said, so much is at stake. We have a republic to save in this debt ceiling negotiation. We are $32 trillion in debt. We're going to 50 under this president. We have inflation because $10 trillion has been pumped into the economy. So this sentence, I really appreciate you giving it to us, Ambassador Hogan, because I intend to use it. Turning to in your testimonies, you tend to, and I just appreciated Congresswoman Dean's discussion, because in your testimonies, you tend to treat nations as isolated nations. They're not in this part of the world. With over a decade in Europe and the Middle East, to include an embassy, NATO, European Command, Central Command, so forth, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia are probably the toughest neighborhood in this region. They sit between Russia, Iran, Turkey. This is a tough neighborhood. We talk about many tough neighborhoods around the world. This is probably the toughest. And it's also complicated. Azerbaijan aligns itself with the West, Armenia with the East, yet Azerbaijan has the Chinese Belt and Road projects in it. Armenia does not. And the railroad went through Georgia, bypassed Armenia. Armenia gets from the Freedom House a 55 out of 100 ranking. And again, they're aligned with the East. Azerbaijan gets a 10 out of 100 ranking from Freedom House. So this is a complex situation. I hope you can move forward with not only Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, but it is a complex situation. And then I wanted to go to Kosovo and Serbia. What is your position on the territorial swap that's been suggested, and I think dismissed, a UN seat for Kosovo and Serbia recognition of Kosovo? What is the State Department's position in those former Republic of Yugoslavia nations?
Thank you, Congressman. The U.S. position is that we very much support the EU's normalization process between Kosovo and Serbia. And so in that a set of agreements, both countries commit to taking certain action and as a result, moving into the EU through the normal process. And so when it comes to the territorial swap, that's not contemplated. And in this agreement, what is contemplated is that, for example, Kosovo would have to create an association of Serbian municipalities for northern Kosovo, and which sort of provides local governance mechanisms for that community. Serbia would have to agree not to oppose Kosovo's membership in international organization, and among many other provisions in each of these agreements. So as they move forward down this path, we consider it to be legally binding, these agreements. We hope to see a very much normalization of ties between those two countries.
Okay, I think that's sanguine, but I understand. I will tell you, in terms of the cuts, you're paying the price of the Afghanistan withdrawal. Let's just be honest. This administration made a strategic blunder of epic proportions with the Afghanistan withdrawal. And we can talk all day about giving you money for doing all these noble things, but I feel for you because you are paying the price for an epic strategic blunder. My time is up. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Self. We now proceed to the former chairman of the Transatlantic Dialogue, Congressman Jim Costa of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to cover some of the areas that have been touched upon here, but Ambassador Hogan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, clearly has been noted a tough challenge here. I, for one, am believing that Azerbaijan has not lived up to their agreements that have been a part of this peace effort. And I'm wondering two quick questions. The demining, or the funding for demining in the controlled areas in Karabakh from the 2020 war, obviously presents a clear and present danger. Are we going to continue to provide support to demine those areas?
Sir, I'm going to have to get back to you on that particular question, unless Ms. Maria Longi. No.
We do have continued humanitarian demining in Azerbaijan, and we will have to get back to you on in Nagorno-Karabakh on the demining. But
Well, yes, and an extension of that, the blockade that Azerbaijan had put in place earlier this year in that corridor to provide support for food and other humanitarian aid. What is the administration's efforts to ensure that that corridor remains open so that the people in Nagorno-Karabakh, or as the Armenians refer to, Artsakh, is able to be used?
Congressman, a robust diplomatic engagement at the highest levels. The Secretary raises this repeatedly with President of Azerbaijan, Aliyev, speaking about the importance of a free and open corridor, particularly when it comes to commercial and private traffic.
Well, it's essential. I mean, if Azerbaijan's going to live up to their agreements, this has got to be a part of the deal.
That's right. That's right. That's what we're working on, sir.
Let me move over to Ukraine. I don't know if, Madam McKee, if you care to respond. What was the amount of the grain exports that were produced in Ukraine last year that we were able to get out of the country? What numbers are you using?
So the latest numbers that we have on our Agricultural Resilience Initiative, which we plussed up under the supplemental resources, the numbers that we're using are based on what we see on the various routes of the overland and littoral routes. I will have to get back to you with the specific
All right, well,
tonnage.
I mean, I'm looking at percentages. I mean, 80% of the grain production, I mean, clearly Putin has weaponized
Yes.
this effort, and there have been negotiations. Now he's seemingly to go on a short-term initiative extensions of what has been agreed upon, but it's blatant its attempt to weaponize grain that impacts not only Ukraine, but the other people that grain provides sustenance for.
So, sir, the Black Sea Grain Initiative was able to facilitate the export of 30 million metric tons, and then the EU Solidarity Lanes,
Right.
that's the overland route, I think is about 23 million metric tons.
But
So-
they're down, the latest numbers, at least for the last season, the levels that they've been able to export are down anywhere between 50 and 30%.
Well, then, how does the overall strategy by the administration, would you best describe with USAID and the state's overall efforts to provide non-security assistance to Ukraine? I mean, we're not going to do a supplemental, is that my understanding? And does this assistance, continued assistance, believe Ukraine's going to have what they need in terms of non-security needs?
So our fiscal year, our current assistance, we believe is covering what we need for the end of this fiscal year. We're, of course, constantly assessing the situation on the ground, but we believe we have what we need to go through the end of this fiscal year.
Okay. And so finally, you know, many of us have accused Russia for what they've done. President Putin's actions are that of a war criminal in terms of their violation of human rights, and it's also resulted in forced adoptions of Ukrainian children, better termed, in my view, kidnapping. It's critical that as the war continues in its aftermath, that humanitarian assistance supports the efforts to reunite these Ukrainian children. What are these efforts to hold Russia accountable for their outrageous activities in this effort?
Sir, we have a variety of mechanisms. So when it comes to the OSCE, we have the Moscow mechanism, which goes in and reports on all of the atrocities of the war crimes. We have the UN Commission of Inquiry. We have just what was just inaugurated last week at the Council of Europe summit that I mentioned earlier in Reykjavik, Iceland. We established the creation of a register of damages committed by Russian forces in Ukraine. So these are all tools to be able to establish claims for when adjudicative bodies are set up, for example, including the special tribunal on the
Well, we're
crime of
going to
aggression.
need to
That
do
will be
this
part
at
of
the
that.
close of this war. My time's expired, but we don't have any numbers, do we, of the amount of children that have been kidnapped?
Yes, we do. The Ukrainian government currently puts that number at over 16,000.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and you'll provide that information that you indicated to me that you earlier did not have at your finger. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. We now proceed to Congressman Bill Huizenga of Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And I, too, had some questions regarding the Balkans, but I believe that was mostly asked and answered by my colleague, Representative Wagner. So I'm going to move on to another issue that has, frankly, not gotten a lot of attention, which is the Arctic. I asked Secretary Blinken about this when he was here last. I come from Michigan. I chair the U.S.-Canada IPG, the Interparliamentary Group. There's quite a bit of concern, and I think rightfully so, with some of the actions in the Arctic with Russia. And as you may know or recall, in April of this year, the Russian Coast Guard signed a memorandum of understanding with the Chinese Coast Guard to strengthen maritime cooperation and ostensibly combat terrorism, illegal migration, smuggling of drugs and weapons, and illegal fishing. However, I think experience speaks loudly to this, and that scope of the portfolio really provides China with the leverage potentially to utilize its standard practice of harassing vessels from other countries with aggressive and even illegal actions. Furthermore, as China partners with Russia, they continue to try to establish and exploit their quote-unquote polar Silk Road and promote their baseless near-Arctic state claim. So, Assistant Secretary, I'm curious, how is the State Department engaged with our European partners, and especially those within the Arctic Coalition, to combat the influence in the Arctic region? After years of trying to keep China out, obviously it looks like they got a side door into the Arctic area. So please help me understand what State is doing about this.
Congressman, you are right to be concerned about this issue, and frankly, the Russia PRC no limits partnership, quote unquote, extends to the Arctic. So I think you called it exactly right. What we're doing The Secretary outlined in October of last year our strategy, our U.S. Arctic strategy, which is based on 4 pillars: security, climate change and environmental protection, sustainable economic development, as well as international cooperation and governance. And so we very much see Russia, as well as the PRC, looking to establish dominance in this region. What we've been doing, sir, is first of all focus on our bilateral partnerships with the countries in the Arctic, particularly in the security realm. A number.
But we walked away from the official organization.
No, the Arctic Council, we're still there, sir. What the Arctic Council has done, and this is one of the areas that we sort of referenced earlier, is that it has suspended participation with Russia in any activity. And so the Council still very much is working. It is moving forward with projects that we support. These are not security-focused projects, but we are able to focus on things such as climate change, maritime biodiversity, et cetera.
Sure. Okay, hold on. Let's stop right there, though.
Okay.
But this is a military threat. It's not a climate threat. It's not a sustainable development threat. This is a military threat. We know that Canada found Chinese listening buoys in the Arctic.
And
All right?
so that's
And so,
sorry.
just a second. I understand your report was very loaded up on the climate-related priorities and the sustainable economic development priorities, but I want to know what the lasting impact is going to be on the encroachment into a growing vital economic and especially military and security zone. So, and should NATO be playing a role in this? What else should be happening?
No, that's exactly where I was going, sir. When it comes to NATO, it very much views the high north as part of its area of responsibility. So when you include now Finland as being the 31st member of the alliance, we're looking to make Sweden, hopefully by the Vilnius summit in July, the 32nd member. When you think about as well the security arrangements that we have established with all of the countries and in the Arctic, 88 F-35s for Canada, for example. That's a $14 billion upgrade. We are moving forward with this a defense cooperation.
But it's
agreement
also
with Sweden.
icebreakers and it's other thing outside of State Department. I understand that, and my time is expiring. But I want to make sure that there is an eye not just to the important issue of climate change and development, sustainable development, whatever that amorphous phrase might be, to understand that we are vulnerable at the north. And we have seen this with the Chinese spy balloon that came over. We're seeing them with incursions in. And this agreement with Russia is one that needs to have attention and we should be concerned about. So I look forward to working with you on a tougher line on that. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Ambassador Hogan, in your written testimony, you state that U.S. assistance to Ukraine aims to give Ukraine the tools necessary to help defend its sovereignty, consolidate its democracy, and move into the EU and global markets. I am concerned, however, that neither you nor our other witnesses mentioned the goal to restore Ukraine's territorial integrity. Mr. Hogan, for the record, does the U.S. support Ukraine aim to also help restore territorial integrity as defined by its 1991 borders?
Sir, that is very much our policy, consistent with UN Charter principles as well, territorial integrity.
Okay. And why was that not in your written testimony as part of your stated goals?
Sir, I believe that must have been an oversight then. It very much is our policy.
And thank you. Ambassador Hogan, I am concerned that the value of weapons being transferred per month to Ukraine from the U.S. stocks using drawdown authority is decreasing ahead of Ukraine's critical counteroffensive. I'm even more troubled after the recent announcement that due to an accounting error, which overvalued weapons being transferred to Ukraine from U.S. stocks, that there is an additional $3 billion in presidential authority available. It's disappointing that these funds weren't used to surge additional weapons to Ukraine ahead of its counteroffensive. Can you pledge to us here today that the State Department will do everything in its power to make up for precious time and rectify that mistake by immediately preparing for large drawdown packages to Ukraine?
We will continue to work with the Department of Defense. They are doing the recalculations now, and so that valuation has not hindered us from giving what we think we need to give to the Ukrainians, and so we will keep apace and we will keep engaging with the Department of Defense and the interagency to make sure that we give Ukraine what they need with the authorities that we have.
What is the current level of funding remaining in the supplemental accounts that are overseen and implemented by the State Department and USAID?
I do not have those numbers with me, but we will get those. We will get those to you.
Do you expect that all of these funds will last until the end of the fiscal year?
That is our estimate right now, and we are continuing. We are continuing to assess these as we on a daily basis, and so we will. At this point, we do think that we have sufficient resources through the end of the fiscal year, but we will come to you if and when we think otherwise.
How about, and so therefore, it won't last until the end of the calendar year?
I can't answer that right now. I don't know.
Okay. On one other point, the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. I was glad to see Secretary Blinken convene Armenian and Azeri leaders several weeks ago to engage in negotiations, but it remains to be seen if these talks will actually lead to any lasting peace. Ambassador Hogan, or anybody on this panel, can you please give us a status update on the negotiations, please?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. We are following 3 weeks of intense diplomatic engagement with the two sides here. We're now looking to see what can be done in the most contentious areas. As I mentioned earlier, they include the distancing of forces, Azerbaijani-Armenian forces. It also includes the border delimitation and recognizing both sides, what is the common border. It also includes, Mr. Chairman, the rights and securities of ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. We put forward a number of ideas to help the two sides come together on these particular issues, and so they are looking at, reviewing our ideas. We've been following up. I just had a meeting with the Foreign Minister of Azerbaijan as well as the Foreign Minister of Armenia just last week to see where we can move forward. The EU is also playing a very helpful role. They convened the two leaders just 2 weeks ago, and they will be meeting with them again 2 weeks from now. And so we've been very much doing a tag team effort here.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, late breaking news out of the region. As of yesterday morning, the Armenian Prime Minister Pashinyan, in a 4-hour press conference, asserted, and it was the first time sort of very publicly asserted, Armenia's recognition of Azerbaijan's territorial integrity, which was an important first step that the team had put on the table. And this assertion is inclusive of Nagorno-Karabakh. Return to highlighting the importance of the 1975 Soviet General Staff map. We're waiting on Azerbaijan's response, but that is progress.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Lawler from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador McKee, good to see you again. Enjoyed getting to speak with you in Chicago for the Moldovan American Convention 2 weeks ago. I'm pleased that the administration appointed a special envoy for Northern Ireland at the end of last year. This position is critically important to strengthen ties with Northern Ireland, fully implement the Good Friday Agreement, and further develop trade relations. Mr. Hogan, can you please provide a general update on the U.S. mission to Northern Ireland, specifically as it relates to the Windsor Agreement and greater trade relations?
Thank you, Congressman. As you know, the President was just in Belfast to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. The Special Envoy, Joe Kennedy III, was with the President, actually stayed behind to work on what the President had laid out to be a very important trade delegation mission that we hope to be able to pull off with American companies going to Belfast sometime in the fall. So we've been having ongoing discussions with His Majesty's government as well as with our consulate in Belfast to make sure that we're all on the same page there.
Okay. I was in Taiwan with Chairman McCall just about almost 2 months ago, and I was deeply concerned about French President Emmanuel Macron's trip to China, as well as his statements subsequently, in which he said that Europe should not follow, quote, the American rhythm, unquote, on Taiwan. What does that even mean? I don't know. But do you believe France's relationship with the Chinese Communist Party and President Xi is compromising their position on Taiwan? Is it a sentiment being shared by other European countries? And do you believe President Macron's statements compromise or in any way hinder U.S. policy towards Taiwan?
Congressman, we have had a number of conversations, both privately and bilaterally, as well as in a collective format, the Quad, G7, including most recently the G7 Leaders Summit in Hiroshima.
Did the President speak to President Macron specifically about this?
This is very much part of our ongoing conversation with President Macron, as well as, of course, his leadership team, the foreign minister, et cetera. When it comes to where we stand on PRC, we see ourselves as essentially on the same page. We see the cross-strait tensions as being something that's not only a problem for that part
Sorry,
of the
just to
world.
be clear, you see who on the same page? France and the United States?
France, the United States, as well as the rest of the G7, as outlined in the G7 leaders' statement there, and made clear the challenges, the problems that we see with the PRC, particularly when it comes to Taiwan, as well as when it comes to everything else that the PRC is doing, economic coercion, disinformation, et cetera.
The statement also refuted the South China Sea claims, which I think was not welcome in the PRC.
Okay. What is the administration doing to ramp up cybersecurity cooperation in Europe to strengthen resilience across the region and push back against increased Russian cyber campaigns?
I can start, and then you can definitely do the specifics. So we've been working in the on cybersecurity for several years in the region, even before the Russia invaded Ukraine. In Ukraine, we've got a very substantial program. We also received supplemental funding in December, $50 million to do more cybersecurity in the Western Balkans. We are working on programming about $25 million of that in Albania in response to some very targeted and damaging cyber attacks from Iran. And we are in the process of planning out how the rest of those funds will be used. I've made a number of trips to the region, and a lot of the engagements with government officials are them asking for our assistance to help them set up frameworks and do cybersecurity. So we do see receptivity on the civilian, and as well, the Department of Defense is also working with several countries in the region on cybersecurity.
As part of the whole of government effort, if you will, what we've done in Ukraine and across the region is actually anchored in our anti-corruption efforts as we move out e-governance and more transparent and agile service delivery systems. The other side of the equation in protecting those systems and that information has been a top priority. And so with the state-sponsored attacks and obviously straight out of Putin's playbook for the asymmetric tools of cyber attacks, the wake-up call and the response and the demand signals for that work has only increased, and luckily we have programs in place to be able to expand and respond to those requests.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Lawler yields back. Ms. Moran from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Hogan, I'd like to start with you. I want to revisit a little bit about this discussion about Mr. President Macron's discussion of China and his comments after coming back from China. In particular, he really suggested that any crisis regarding Taiwan would not be a concern to Europe. generally. I didn't understand why he would say such a thing. I'm curious about a couple of things. First, do you know, has there been any reaction from other European leaders as to his comments about Taiwan and China?
Yes, there have been a number of reactions, all very much aligning with the U.S. Position on this issue. So there have been a clear messages given on that regard.
Have we seen any other countries align with his comments to side on his side of the equation?
I would, sir, say that since those comments, we have had a number of engagements with France, including at the head of state level, where we have found ourselves to be very much on the same page when it comes to Taiwan. So I would respectfully not say that we're on different pages there. We think we're on the same side and pursuing this very serious global threat that we have.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Unfortunately, the language he used coming back from China actually indicated he was on an opposite side from American foreign policy. I'm curious if we've been able to uncover or discover whether or not there's something motivating his action on behalf of France to side with China. Are there economic agreements that we're not aware of yet, or other partnership opportunities that he's pursuing with China that are driving his foreign policy?
Sir, I don't want to go too far in terms of getting into his thinking, but I would say that managing the relationship with the PRC is very difficult for countries because of the complex economic relationships that these countries have, including, quite frankly, that the United States has as well with the PRC. So what the term that we have all been using is something that European Commission President von der Leyen had said in her March 30th speech. This is really not so much about decoupling from China, but more about de-risking from China. And so all of us, and including made very clearly at the G7 Leaders Summit, have focused on ways that we can do that in a coordinated manner.
Okay. Thank you. Ambassador McKee, let me turn to a different topic. Could you go into more detail about the State Department and USAID programming in Central Europe to strengthen democracy and the civil society there? What are the metrics that are used to evaluate the successes of that programming?
Congressman, thank you for the question. We, as a result of the recognition and concerns around democratic backsliding in 2021, we received the directive and started programming and launched in several countries, primarily Hungary and Poland, but also targeting in the Czech Republic, Slovenia, Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria as well, with building out and strengthening civil society, independent voices, working on both sides of the information equation by, countering propaganda or providing fact-based information, but also working on citizen literacy and critical thinking so that they can make better choices about the types of information that they receive.
And how are you determining whether or not you're being successful in those efforts?
So the hits, the outreach, and the numbers trained, we just started rolling out the programs in December, and so we've only got about 5 months under our belt. I'm happy to provide those, both the metrics and how we're monitoring and evaluating and how we're doing once we have some of those, a bit more time under our belt.
Okay, Ambassador Hogan, I want to come back to you on the same topic. How does the state ensure this programming increases the resiliency of democratic institutions, including to foreign malign influence in the critical part of the EU and NATO without antagonizing allied governments?
Thank you on that. I would say, Congressman, that we can look at how these countries vote with us, for example, in UN or other multilateral fora. That's one good metric. We, of course, also look at polling data to see favorability ratings, for example, of the United States, of NATO, of EU. We also want to make sure that our programs, when it comes to media literacy, so that the average citizen in a particular country is able to disentangle misinformation, disinformation from accurate information. And so our embassies are working hand in hand with our assistance efforts here in the State Department as well as USAID to make sure that we are increasing the media literacy in these countries.
Okay. Ambassador McKee, you want to add one comment? I know I'm out of time, but
Just really quickly, the conversation I had with the Polish government counterparts last fall in 2022 were probably very different than the conversations I would have had in 2021 when the intent was first provided to us from Congress. There is receptivity because there's an existential threat at their doorstep, and we're fighting for democracy on the continent, and so hopefully it won't translate into reduced votes or other areas of challenge as we implement these programs.
Ms. Longi, I'm sorry I left you out completely on the conversation. I appreciate the work that all three of you do, and I know it's very difficult work and very challenging work, and I do appreciate it. Thank you. Yield back.
Mr. Moran yields back his time. Mr. Schneider from Illinois.
Thank you, and I want to thank the witnesses for your patience, and it's been here a long time, and hopefully bringing it to a close. I had a lot of questions that have already been touched on that we've talked about, but I think some of the overarching themes, Ambassador Hogan, you mentioned it, it's complex. The issues we're facing is complex. We've talked today geographically from the Arctic Ocean down to the Mediterranean. If you look at Europe and I just took a look at the map from the standpoint of bodies of water, it's not just those two, it's the Aegean Sea, the Black Sea, Caspian, there's so many different bodies of water that determine to a great extent the geopolitics of that specific area, and we have to be thinking about it. We have these incredibly complex issues, some existential, as you just mentioned, that they realize that Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine is without question an issue of immediate urgency with existential ramifications. But also there are strategic long-term things we need to be thinking about. How are we going to deal with relations? China, very much one of those. China has an agenda, a set of priorities and intentions that are in stark contrast to what we need to accomplish and work with our allies. So I have a lot of questions. I had a meeting today with the ambassador from Moldova, and we were talking, he was at USAID this morning talking about the role of technology in fighting corruption and in Ukraine, of all things. I have a book, a Ukrainian book on my coffee table, and he was commenting on that. We have to make sure Ukraine wins the war, but we also have to make sure, as they say, Ukraine wins the peace and can not only rebuild economically, politically, from a security standpoint, but that it does it in a way that protects the integrity of its government. So there are so many things I do want to talk about, and maybe I'll start with you, Ambassador Hogan. As we sit here at the end of this hearing, you mentioned we have funding through the end of the fiscal year. That's only a few months away. What do we need to be thinking about long-term, beyond the end of this fiscal year, and preparing for next year so that we are in the best position to achieve our goals into the next decade?
Thank you, sir, and I realize the time is limited, but I would say, first and foremost, we've got to get Ukraine right. Given the stakes involved there, when you have a permanent member of the UN Security Council engaged in nuclear saber rattling, and then this no limits partnership with the PRC, is something that we need to make sure that beyond this fiscal year, Ukraine is able to preserve the territorial integrity that it hopes to be able to maintain as it goes through this counteroffensive that we should be expecting to see soon. And we also need to make sure that it has the assistance it needs for security, economic, humanitarian, to be able to revive its economy, to be able to bring back and attract private sector investment. So I say first and foremost Ukraine, but we also need to look at the strategic opportunities that this war, as disastrous as it has been, has brought when it comes to Europe. We mentioned a number of these already. Azerbaijan and Armenia, closer than ever before to real peace. When we talk about Serbia and Kosovo, now on a real normalization path. Ukraine and Moldova being granted EU candidate status that we hope to see by the end of the year, perhaps they having checked all the boxes when it comes to the recommendations. NATO expanding to the 31st, potentially the 32nd. I could go on, but these are opportunities that we need to seize in the years ahead.
Administrator McKee, thoughts?
So I couldn't agree more. What Ukraine and our support to Ukraine represents is the future of a stable, rules-based international order, grounded in the values that we share. And so I couldn't agree more with Assistant Secretary Hogan that we've got to get it right in Ukraine. And I think we are. I'm confident that the security assistance and the pace at which it's being provided has, by all of the allies, but first and foremost by the United States, is definitively helping them advance and hopefully win the war. But at the same time, we've got to win the peace and secure the peace and make sure it's enduring. And that means helping Ukraine build the nation that they are fighting so hard for. You know, and using that example and the tectonic shift that we're seeing across the region as a moment for to revitalize and restore and demonstrate how democracy can deliver, and what it means to have freedom and not just words, but actually the demonstrative effect of choice, opportunity, the job that you want to have, the school that you want to go to, the language you want to speak, the information you want to read. These are fundamental, I would say almost human rights that in democratic, you know, in places where there's the democratic space is closing, et cetera, the wake-up call that Putin has provided us for the free world is an opportunity that we must seize. And if we're successful in Ukraine, it will be that beacon of demonstrable proof that might does not make right.
Thank you. And Ms. Longi, I'm over time, but if the chair will indulge.
Yeah, I'll be quick, but I think Ukraine is the crux of the resource issue, I think, for us looking forward. And if you just look at the 10-year needs assessment done by the World Bank, they estimated it'll be at least $411 billion to rebuild and reconstruct Ukraine. We are not going to do that as the United States of America, nor are all the other bilateral donors. And so we are putting a good bit of effort with this with other donor countries. The G7 donor coordination platform is just getting kicked off. The private sector is anxious to get back in there, and I think that as we are coming to you with the FY24 budget request and the following years, that is all going to be shaped in the context of how Europe and the private sector rebuild and address the issues in Ukraine. So it's a complex one on that front too, but I think those are other places where we are putting our time when it comes to how our resources are used with other countries' resources.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the extended time, and the witnesses, I appreciate your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. It was a pleasure to have you on the committee today. With no further questions from the members, I want to thank our witnesses. I'm sorry. Mr. Self. Yes, certainly. Mr. Self, in 5 minutes.
Thank you. Ms. Longi, last time we were together, we talked about audits, going through the World Bank, and at that time, we hadn't completed any audits. You promised that the audits were ongoing. What's the progress so far in Ukraine? Sorry, we're talking about Ukraine. Audits in Ukraine. Last time we spoke, you had provided one report, I believe, but had not completed any audits. What's the progress?
Yeah, Erin will do that one.
Okay.
Sure, I'll take that. So thank you, Congressman. Just to refresh the various measures that we have in place for accountability and oversight. Remember, the World Bank mechanism is on a reimbursement basis.
That was my second question, but
Right.
go ahead.
And so the third-party monitoring that we have in place by Deloitte is not an audit. It is to monitor the basis upon which those receipts, if you will, or the validation of the expenditures from the various line ministries are provided through the Ministry of Finance for reimbursement.
But that's only one of the, we also had 3 other audits, I believe.
So
What's the progress on those?
we have not conducted a full audit yet. We're putting in place a third-party auditing mechanism out of the 4 supplemental funds. But what we have, in addition to the third-party oversight, the reimbursement mechanism, the systems in place, as well as a partnership with the GAO to help build the Ukrainian Supreme Audit Authority, their capability to do a better job and support independent and objective auditing of their own books. We hope to have the third-party audit team in place as soon as we have finished scoping what is critical and where some of the gaps, if any, are determined that require that auditing oversight. Last and most importantly, I would like to mention our Office of Inspectors General, both DOD, state, and AID. They've been on a few TDYs, temporary oversight to check on things. We have we have agreement for 6 positions, for the permanent positions at the embassy in Kyiv. How that distributes between state aid and DOD will be seen, but the OAG is keenly focused on providing that additional oversight. So far, based on the site visits and trips that they've made, they have, and I believe they testified to the House Oversight Committee, they have not found any substantial instances of fraud, waste, or abuse to date.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Now, with no further questions from the members, I want to thank our witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for the questions. I personally am glad that this panel has reconfirmed that the Biden administration is prepared to help Ukraine restore its territorial integrity to its 1991 borders when all of Ukraine, including Crimea, voted for independence from the Soviet Union. The members of this subcommittee may have some additional written questions for the witnesses, and we ask you to respond to these promptly in writing. Pursuant to the committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.